Okay. Yeah. So what kind of correlations are there between American foreign policy and our own domestic problems? Well, as far as I know, there have been no direct studies of that, but you sort of know what to look for. I mean, for example, there have been studies that relate militarization of the economy to domestic economic problems. And, well, for example, there's some discussion of that in Seymour Melman's recent book, Profits Without Production. And the other sources. And what it shows is sort of what you'd expect, that military Keynesianism as an industrial planning program has very selective effects. I mean, it does give jobs to highly trained people, and it supports advanced industry. So, for example, take, say, computers. Computers, we pretend here that Japan, that in Japan the state is intervening in the economy, but here it's free enterprise. Actually, it's more or less the same, just slightly different mechanisms. So say take computers, which are sort of a main element of the technologically advanced economy. In the 1950s, virtually all the funding for research and development and also virtually all purchases of computers were from the military. In the 1960s, it went down to about 50%. And today, for example, we're trying to meet the Japanese challenge with what's called a fifth-generation computer, supercomputer, huge program with billions and billions of dollars. It's being done through the Pentagon, NASA, which is really military-oriented, despite what they say, and the Department of Energy, which is also a military department. It's the department that builds nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. So we use the military system to support what's called sometimes sunrise industry, and that has its particular effect. It means that we end up with an economy, there's a tendency towards an economy with a lot of money for managers and so on, and owners and so on, and centralized high technology sector of the economy, and also some for skilled workers. But then for the rest, it's it's kind of it becomes a service economy. A lot of people either unemployed or, serving, McDonald's and that kind of stuff. And you can see it. You can see it in the statistics. I mean, it's what they call these days the decline of the middle class, meaning the relative decline of the middle income sectors with the increase in wealth for the super rich, or the top 5% or something, and a big increase in the poorer sectors. And of course, it also means that the basic structure of our economy just deteriorates. I mean, computers and all that sort of thing, it's okay, but that's not what people need to live. What you need to live is other things, and the other things disappear. Now, here there is, in fact, a serious, significant difference between our system and the Japanese system. So the Japanese system does have direct state intervention in the economy. There's an institution, MITI, Ministry of International Trade and Industry, which coordinates industrial policy planning. It brings together the main sectors of Japanese industry. It brings them together, they make plans and so on and so forth, just as our system does through the Pentagon, but they don't do it through the military system. They do it oriented towards the commercial market. So their industrial planning system, which involves state centralization, as every modern system does, is oriented toward the commercial market, and ours is oriented towards waste production, which is basically what the military system is. Now, there are good historical reasons for that, but the net effect is obvious. The net effect is that they wipe us out of competition. So we produce better than they do. Our waste production is much superior to theirs. Like we produce, more fancy jet planes and bigger missiles and all that kind of stuff, but they produce better things that sell. And that's not because of something in the genes, it's because of institutional structures. So there is a very clear, and so for example, take today, see here there's a difference between Reagan and Kennedy. The Reagan and Kennedy programs, as I mentioned, are very similar. And that tells you something about the real spectrum of politics in the United States, incidentally. The Kennedy administration, if you pull aside the rhetoric and you look at its programs, it consisted of regressive fiscal measures to support new investment, what we call now supply-side economics. That was really the only domestic program. The other, well, there was one other. The other major domestic program was the big buildup of the military under McNamara. And then the international policies were search for international confrontation. Kennedy administration practically got us into a nuclear war about maybe 3 times in the first 2 years, and then it backed off a little, and a lot of aggression. So invasion of South Vietnam, Cuba, the whole, what I described in Latin America, and so on. However, and that's like Reagan. But there was a difference. During the Kennedy period, this probably had a, what you might call a beneficial effect on the economy. That is, the economy also grew. Under the Reagan administration, this really isn't happening. There's what they call recovery, but it's recovery from a big recession. And they're hoping now that the number of unemployed at the time of the election will be the same as it was when Reagan came in. And meanwhile, during this big buildup of the recovery, incidentally, was led by military industry. While the recovery is going on, it's okay for very relatively rich people or people connected with high tech or something. But meanwhile, we're, I suppose, the only industrial society, or only advanced industrial society, where there are plenty of people dying of starvation in the streets, or in places like Boston, where it's cold in the winter, sleeping in the streets, mothers and children and so on, thousands and thousands. Nobody really knows how many because, these people don't count. They're like peasants in Central America. They're not real people. But that's going on at the same time, and that wasn't a concomitant of the Kennedy policies, not because the Kennedy liberals were somehow more humane, but because the world has changed. At that period, in 1960, the United States really was the world dominant power. I mean, we were just overwhelmingly dominant in economic and security and other dimensions. Now it's less true. Now, for all sorts of reasons, while we're still the most powerful country, we don't control things. Like the world is more complex. Both the United States and the Soviet Union have suffered a reduction in their power to coerce, though they increase in absolute power. And this means there are a lot of things that could be done easily in the early 60s that can't be done today. So just to give one index, in the early 60s, the Kennedy administration was concerned over the viability of the Japanese economy. They were afraid it was unviable, and they were trying to figure out some way to keep it going and so on. That's not Reagan's problem today. And that's one indication of the change that's taken place. That's why the commitment to waste production as our industrial planning system, which is about what it amounts to, has very deleterious effects today in a way in which it didn't 20 years ago. So I think that way you can really find the correlation. Yeah.
Yeah. What can people do here, and how important is like mass direct action and civil disobedience and stopping intervention?
That's really the most important question of all. What can be done about it all? And I think, it's not a big secret. I think we all know what can be done about it all. We may choose not to do what can be done, but we know what to do. I mean, we know from our own recent experience. So, for example, let's compare again the early 1980s with the early 1960s. Okay? Two very similar administrations came into power. They did very similar things. So, for example, let's look at the problem that the Kennedy liberals faced, say, in Indochina, which was their main concern in about 1961. In 1954, you don't mind a little history, let's put this in because it's very similar to what's going on in Central America today, and we can learn, not only ruling groups can learn from history, other people can too if they pay attention. In 1954, we moved in to try to prevent a political settlement. After the French had left and then a political settlement was arranged, we had to move in to undermine it, and we did. The next 6 years in South Vietnam were like what's been going on in Central America for the last couple of years. That is, for the next 6 years, a basically mercenary American army was established in South Vietnam, which was set to massacring the population. That was so-called the miracle of, the Diem miracle, and all kind of names for it. But it was just a massacre. So, for example, like Bernard Fall, who's a big hawk, incidentally, and a military specialist and so on, he calculated the number of people killed then at about 80,000 in those years. It's a lot, Meanwhile, the main attack at that time was against the anti-French resistance, what we here call the Viet Cong, basically the anti-French resistance, which we recognized and had always recognized to be the nationalist movement in the South. So the main purpose was kind of like Carter in El Salvador. Try to wipe out the nationalist movement, and then, you know, you can have free elections and all that sort of nice stuff. That's what was going on in the late 60s. And there was no resistance. Interestingly, there was no resistance because at that time, the nationalist movement, what we call the communists, were committed to trying to get the international agreements established. They hoped that there would be some way to realize the international settlement proposed at Geneva in 1954. By 1959, they'd been virtually decimated. The Viet Cong, so-called, had been virtually decimated, and they were then authorized to use force in self-defense. Well, as soon as they were authorized to use force in self-defense, the American established client government collapsed because it was really based on nothing except a monopoly of violence. And once it no longer had a monopoly of violence, it just fell apart. That's called here North Vietnamese aggression or Russian aggression or something like that, namely the right of the people who are being attacked to defend themselves. Same in El Salvador, incidentally. If you know, we have a big argument here about whether Nicaragua and Cuba are sending arms to El Salvador. Well, I don't know. You know, so far there's no evidence that they are. But that's not really the interesting question. I mean, you know, you got to watch the way questions are framed by the propaganda system. The way it's framed is the doves say they're not sending arms and the hawks say they are sending arms. But the real question, which is being suppressed in all of this, is should they be sending arms? And the answer is, of course, yes. Everybody should be sending arms. We shouldn't. See, that question is not raised. Just as if we were having, you know, if somebody was talking in, say, the Soviet Union, and the question came up, should somebody send arms to Afghan rebels? Well, of course not. You know, that's terrorism or something like that. So here, the point is that it's perfectly legitimate to send arms to people who finally try to use violence and self-defense against a gang of mass murderers installed by a foreign power. Of course it's legitimate to send them arms. Chances are nobody's doing it. And they're not doing it not because it's wrong to do it, but because they're just intimidated. You don't get in the way of a rogue elephant, you know. So you know, and you don't mess around with the United States. So therefore people probably aren't sending them arms. That's the way the question sort of ought to be put. Anyhow, in 1959, the so-called Viet Cong were given authorization to use force in self-defense. The government system collapsed, just as what's happening in El Salvador now. And Kennedy administration came in. They had to make a decision. And what they decided to do was to carry out the direct attack against South Vietnam. Now, that's an event that doesn't exist in American history. In American history, there is no such event as the American attack against South Vietnam. Just as in, say, Russian history, there's no such event as the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. They have a thing called the Russian defense of Afghanistan against international terrorists and so on, aided from abroad. And we have a thing called the defense of South Vietnam against international terrorists aided from abroad. But the fact is that with even more validity in the, I mean, you know, it's unfair to the Russians to make this comparison, I should say. But in the case of Vietnam, we just invaded the country in 1961. 1961 and 62 is when the American Air Force began its direct participation, that means American pilots and American planes, in large-scale bombing of the peasants of South Vietnam, which at that time was 85% of the population. And the goal at that time was to try to drive several million of them into what we called strategic hamlets, actually concentration camps surrounded by barbed wire, where they were supposed to be free to choose their own representatives without, you know, without the interference of the Viet Cong, who we admitted they voluntarily supported. Now that's called an invasion when some other country does it. When somebody starts, you know, when some power starts carrying out massive bombing of another country, and in this case also defoliation and, you know, concentration of the population in concentration camps and so on and so forth, that's called an invasion. But in our case, since we did it, it's called a defense. Okay, that happened in 1961, and it then expanded into a bigger invasion and so on and so forth. All right, why is that? And that's the problem that Reagan's facing. Similar situation. In fact, he was facing it in 1981. Now, if you notice, there was a different reaction. In 1981, the Reagan administration did not invade South Vietnam, El Salvador. They certainly wanted to. I don't think there's any doubt that they wanted to. They were gearing up for it. As soon as they came in, they were gearing up for a direct invasion, and they've been trying to get American troops in there ever since, both against El Salvador and against Nicaragua. And they're sort of slowly managing it, you know. Like, for example, the participation of U.S. Air Force pilots in direct control of bombing and ground operations. Okay, that sort of insinuates the American forces in there a little more. But what's interesting, and that gets back to the question what you can do, is that the Kennedy administration had no problem. They could, if they wanted to invade South Vietnam in 1961, they just did it. There was no protest. Couldn't get two people together in a room to talk about it. And in fact, as late as the real history of this is worth remembering. It was, take a city like Boston, which is a pretty liberal city. As late as the spring of 1966, when we had about 200,000 troops in there, you couldn't hold a public meeting to oppose the war because it would be broken up by students with the applause of the press. That's as late as the spring of '66. And then we had a couple 100,000 troops in there. We'd already extended the war to the rest of Indochina and so on. But now they can't do it. And so the Reagan administration came in with immediate plans to do what Kennedy did in the early '60s, similar situation, do the same thing, and they've been unable to do it. They're sort of slowly, what they're doing is bad enough, but what they're doing is sort of a continuation of what the United States did in South Vietnam in the late '50s, and what, say, Carter did in El Salvador. That is, what they're doing is trying to control the population through massacre, but without extensive participation of the American forces, and they probably can't continue that much longer because we have a mercenary army there and it probably won't hold. Mercenary forces just don't fight very well. That's an old message. They don't fight like the people we call guerrillas, that is, people fighting to defend their homes and so on and so forth. They fight differently. Consequently, it's likely that they will have to send American troops, and they've felt that for several years. When the White Paper came out in February 1981, it was an effort, it was surely an attempt to build a basis for sending the troops. Well, they couldn't do it because of a thing called the Vietnam syndrome. That's a dread disease that afflicted a large part of the American population finally in the late '60s and the '70s. And the disease is manifested in such symptoms as opposition to massacre and aggression and things like that. And it's interesting that it's called syndrome, sort of something, has to be cured somehow. And they haven't yet found a way to cure it. That means that and that showed up in early 1981. It showed up very clearly. There was spontaneous opposition developed all over the country from all sorts of sources, from, popular, from solidarity groups to church groups to people writing to their congressmen, to all sorts of things showed up. And it's been going on ever since in all sorts of ways. I mean, take sanctuaries, which you don't find much in places like Boston because that's an elite, ideologically advanced, educated, and cultured community where you support the party line without question. But you do find it in other parts of the country where people are less civilized and educated and they don't understand, these things and so on. And that's important, and it's so broad and widespread that it's hard to suppress. And in fact, the nature of the Vietnam syndrome is rather accurately revealed, I think, by some polls which are certainly taken to heart in the government. So, for example, one national poll about a year ago indicated that more than half the population of the United States said that they would support direct resistance if the United States put troops in El Salvador. Now, there was nothing remotely like that during the Vietnam War. I mean, not even, it was statistically undetectable, the proportion that would support resistance. And this is important. Now, the question, of course, it's not enough to have the feeling. That is useless. I don't care what feelings you have. What's important is to do something about it. And what you can do about it, here we recognize that we live in a society which is extremely violent with regard to its international behavior, but it's relatively nonviolent with regard to its domestic upper middle classes, at least. So for the privileged part of the population in the United States, the state uses relatively little violence to control them. Controls them in other ways, but not violence. People like us, are not subjected to intense government violence. On the world scale, it's less than most places. It's different if you're poor, but I'm talking about people like us. That's just a fact, and that means that there's a range of options open, and that range of options stretches from making a nuisance of yourself to your congressman to becoming involved in direct resistance. There's a whole range of options that are open that are not available in societies that, except to heroes, in societies that resort to violence to suppress dissent. So there's a lot that you can do, and I think everybody knows what it is. What you have to do is raise the cost of aggression. Now, there are a lot of ways of raising the cost of aggression, and if you look back it's worth studying what caused the American leadership to decide in 1968 that it wasn't worthwhile sending a couple 100,000 more troops to Vietnam and trying to win a major victory. Well, what made them decide in early 1968, and incidentally that reflected itself in the press about a year later, when the press started criticizing the war, and in scholarship about a year later, and so on. But when business circles turned against the war in early '68, they did it because they regarded the domestic costs as too high. And the domestic costs were disruption, for example. They want, if you own the country, what you want is a placid, obedient population. You don't want any fuss. You don't want people to make a nuisance of themselves, to organize, to ask too much, you don't want even cultural disorder. And all of this was measured. In fact, when the Joint Chiefs were asked whether they would approve of sending 200,000 more troops to Vietnam and South Vietnam in 1968, one of the reasons they opposed it was they said they thought they'd need them for civil disorder control. See, that's important. I mean, what it meant is that the effect of the war was building up a level of dissidence that was dangerous. In fact, there's another problem that developed in that period. And again, ruling circles pay attention to it. The population doesn't much, but we should. And aside from the Vietnam syndrome, there's another terrible thing that happened in the late 60s. It also has a technical name. It's called the crisis of democracy. That also developed at that period. And it's worth studying the way that's perceived by elite groups. In fact, there's a book called The Crisis of Democracy, which you really ought to read very carefully. It was published in 1975 by the Trilateral Commission, which is sort of the liberal wing of the international capitalist ruling elite, the one that put back Carter. The American contribution is written by Samuel Huntington, who's a well-known liberal professor of political science at Harvard. And the other it's trilateral, that means Europe, United States, and Japan, and all of them talked about the crisis of democracy. And it's very intriguing. You learn the answer to what you can do, in part, by seeing what they regard as a crisis. So what they regard as a crisis is, of course, things like the kind of disorders that require troops for civil disorder control. But other things are also a crisis. In fact, the main crisis of democracy that they noticed there was simply that there was the beginning of political organization among large parts of the population. Literally. You have to read this. I mean, you shouldn't believe what I say. You should look it up and see it in their own words. They said that in the 60s, there was the beginning of organization among usually passive groups of the population. So young people, ethnic groups, women, all kind of groups in the population that are usually just passive and obedient and just do what they're told and so on, began to enter into the political arena. They became organized. That's the kind of thing we got to stop. Now, if it's El Salvador, the way we stop it is by mass murder. That's what was happening. They were also getting a crisis of democracy in El Salvador in the 70s. So then we had to move in and wipe out the organizations. So that crisis was put down, and now we can have elections. Well, as I say, in the United States, you don't do that against the privileged part of the population. You do it against other parts, but not against the privileged part of the population. So you couldn't handle the crisis in that way. And they had to figure out other ways to solve the crisis. And to solve it meant to restore the population to apathy, passivity, and obedience. Okay? That would overcome the crisis of democracy. Incidentally, this gives you this partially answers the question what you can do. Of course, what you can do is try to make the crisis of democracy worse. That is, really begin to develop organization and participation in the political system for the first time. That's one thing that can be done, and that just is, creating the problems that caused them to need a couple 100,000 troops for civil disorder control is another thing that can be done, and sort of anything in between. But what's particularly interesting about this is what it reveals about not only the answers that it gives to what you can do, and it means a lot, but it also gives you a very clear idea of the concept of democracy that's held by people with power. Here we know what they mean for El Salvador and Guatemala and Nicaragua and so on. It means that first you murder and wipe out all the popular opposition, and you destroy the press, and you kill the priests and so on, and then you let people go to polls where they're allowed to put pieces of paper into transparent voting boxes. If you look in the paper, you'll notice that whenever there's a picture, they're always transparent. That's by law in El Salvador, something which the observers didn't seem to happen to notice. And so they're allowed to put pieces of paper into a transparent voting box when a member of the army, meaning the death squads, is standing there looking at them. And of course, after the political opposition has been wiped out and the main opposition is not allowed to run and the press has been destroyed and so on. That's the way you carry out democracy. And very much the same concept is held for the mother country itself. So the problem of that's why it was a crisis when people began to organize politically, to participate in the political system. And the concept of democracy that's held really in both cases is, in a way, kind of reminiscent of the feudal system. I mean, the picture of our elites, and this is our liberal elites, the picture is that it's sort of as if there's a nobility, which basically owns things, like the king and the nobles, they basically own everything. And then there are the commoners. That's everybody else, most everybody. And since the nobility is kind of benevolent and really good-hearted, if the commoners come to them with pleas and requests, they can sometimes agree to it. Of course, assuming, of course, that nothing fundamentally changes in the structure of power and wealth and so on and privilege. But the benevolent nobility can sometimes respond to the commoners. But suppose too many commoners begin to make pleas. Well, then you got a crisis. Then you have a crisis. If the commoners are asking too much, you can't respond without changing the structure of power and privilege, and of course that's out. So you have a crisis, and you got to do something about it. What you got to do is either use violence if you have that kind of a society, or find some other way to shut them up if you have a different kind of society. And that's essentially the concept of democracy held by the liberal elites here. In El Salvador, we can use violence to shut them up. Here, we got to use other means of cultural and ideological control. And the way you can act to resist this is simply to extend the crisis of democracy and, meaning develop continuing groups, popular organizations that will continue. It won't just be oriented toward a particular issue and then disappear when that issue gets off the front pages, but will continue to deal with a range of issues, the whole range of integrated issues, and will participate actively in the political system, and will go all the way over to direct civil disobedience, which is certainly legitimate. No doubt that civil disobedience is often legitimate. We know everybody agrees that it's often legitimate. The question is when, and you have to make judgments there about the nature of the violence you're confronting and the means that are available to confront it and so on. But it seems to me those are the things that can be done, and we know from our experience what they are. We also know how ruling groups think about them, which is important. Well, the media's treatment of the Korean airliner, that was a beautiful case, actually, of orchestrated propaganda control. Well, remember what happened. Let me remind you of what happened. On September 1st of last year, the Soviet Union shot down Korean KAL-007, killing 269 people. And this was, the immediate response here was that this proved that the Russians are the most barbaric people since, Attila the Hun or something, and therefore we have to step up the attack against Nicaragua, build MX missiles, put Pershings in West Germany, and increase the military system. In fact, the immediate main reaction here was great euphoria on Wall Street, where commentators pointed out that defense stocks had never looked better, the big rise in defense stocks. All of this was because of this barbarous act, which is the worst thing that ever happened in human history. Well, and the original story, the story was given unbelievable coverage. Not only the story, but the American government interpretation of it, which is roughly what I just said, was given the kind of coverage that I doubt has ever been given to any story in history. I mean, I haven't had a chance to really do the research, but I don't remember any like it. Just to give you an indication, the New York Times publishes an index volume. If you've ever looked at it, the index volume is a very densely printed thing. You practically need a magnifying glass to read it. Big pages, densely published thing. For the month of September alone, the index volume is 7 pages, okay, just on this. Now, you might carry out a research project and ask if there's ever been a story that's gotten that coverage. And it's all from the standpoint of the government. Namely, here, these unbelievable monsters, for no reason other than sadistic love of massacre, killed 269 innocent people. Well, the government story gradually eroded and collapsed, and now basically nothing's left of it, except some funny questions, like, what was that Korean airliner actually doing over the most sensitive area of Russian airspace, and why didn't the American reconnaissance jets, the RC-135s or E-4s or whatever they were nearby, which are sort of indistinguishable from them. Why didn't they signal to the plane, as they certainly had the ability to do, to get out of the region? And what was it doing there in the first place? I mean, how come it was on a great circle route? It's very hard to imagine by a navigational error. There are all kinds of questions like that, and those questions have essentially collapsed the government case, as was sort of quietly admitted in the small print after the political capital had been made. But there's some other things which are never discussed, which I think are even more important. So let me mention a couple. Right in the middle of all of this furor about the Korean airliner, on November 11th, in fact, there was a 100-word item in the New York Times, 100 words. This is compared with this, huge coverage of the Korean airliner. There was 100 words devoted to the interesting fact that UNITA, which is a group that we call freedom fighters, supported by us in South Africa, in Angola, so the freedom fighters that we support along with South Africa, they took credit for shooting down a civilian Angolan jet, killing 126 people. Now, there was no RC-135 in the area, confusing the issue, maybe jamming radar or something like that. It was just pure, plain, unpremeditated murder. Got 100 words in the New York Times. February 9th this year, UNITA took credit for downing another civilian jet. That one wasn't even mentioned. You got to read the foreign press to find that one out. Now, if under the very confused circumstances of KAL-07, if that was the worst atrocity in human history, well, what about the freedom fighters we support along with South Africa, who did something much worse? They just purposely shot down a civilian jet. I mean, granted, the only people killed were black or something, but putting that aside, why is it any different? In fact, it's a lot worse. And in fact, since we're the ones that support them, we're the worst barbarians in history, way worse than the Russians. So let's go back a little further. Those who have a little bit of memory will remember some other cases. For example, in October 1976, a Cubana airliner was blown up with 76 people killed, including the Olympic gold medal winning fencing team of Cuba. And the bomb was placed on the plane by the CIA. It was placed by a CIA agent. He's known. I mean, he continued to be a CIA agent, continued to carry out other atrocities. So the CIA blew up a Cuban civilian airliner in October 1976. This is one small piece of the major war of international terrorism that we wage against Cuba mainly, but also against other countries, which is not called terrorism here because we do it, so therefore it's not terrorism. But there's another one. Or let's go back a little further. In February 1973, Israel, which is again our client state, shot down a jet plane, civilian jet, over the Sinai, killing 110 people. The plane was lost in a sandstorm. It was about 2 minutes flight time away from Cairo. There was no sensitive military, nothing, no confusion, no ambiguity. The orders came from the highest center of the high command, shot it down. Now, this was sort of noticed. There were a couple of references to this in the middle of the KAL-07 business. And so, predictably, a series of lies were produced in the New York Times and elsewhere, saying that that the situation was totally different because Israel had taken responsibility and paid compensation. If you look back, you find that Israel did not take responsibility and refused to pay compensation. That's what in fact happened. What they did was they agreed to something else, what's called ex gratia compensation, meaning just sort of pure humanitarian aid, which is easy enough because we pay for it. But they refused to pay compensation because that would imply responsibility, and they refused any responsibility. In fact, what they did was exactly what the Russians did. They put a couple of pilots on television, and they told how what they did was exactly right and just, and they tried to blame the French pilot. He didn't know how to fly, and so on and so forth. That's what happened. A couple of days after that, Golda Meir came to Washington, premier of Israel. She was, about 4 days later, she was asked no embarrassing questions about this. Press didn't bother her. And she returned home with new military aircraft. That's the way we responded in that case. There was also editorial comment. The New York Times, which was just outraged beyond anything about the Russians, it also had something to say in this case. It said, it had an editorial saying that no purpose is served by acrimonious debate over assignment of blame. That was the phrase they did in this situation of tension and so on. That was the response in that case. Well, if you look back a little further, you can find other things too. For example, in 1955, An Air India plane was blown up with many people killed. In fact, including the people who were killed, was the whole Chinese delegation to the Bandung Conference, the neutralist conference that was held in Indonesia. It turned out it was set by a CIA, the bomb was planted by a CIA agent who later defected and told the story. This was called by the Hong Kong police open premeditated murder or some phrase like that. The purpose of the operation was to kill Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, who was supposed to be on the plane but by accident had gotten off. So they killed the rest of the delegation plus everybody else but not him. Okay, that's 1955. And if you bother, you'll find other cases too. All of this is ignored. You know, the one case which was even mentioned, the Israeli one, was falsified. But all of this is ignored while we have this huge hysteria whipped up about the worst monsters in history, which proves that, like I say, we have to attack Nicaragua and so on and so forth. And the press went along with this virtually 100%. The LA Times is the only newspaper in the United States that I know of that published an honest account of the Israeli case by Robert Scheer. I don't know of any, he published a straight factual account which gave essentially what I've just said. The other cases were never mentioned, and the rest of the press, as far as maybe there's something I missed, but the rest of the press didn't mention any of this stuff. Now, you know, here's an example of the way a really well-disciplined propaganda system works. Total obedience, total subservience to state propaganda. You know, when the state says whip up hysteria against the evil empire, everybody starts screaming and yelling and jumping up and down and screaming about the evil empire. Meanwhile, how do you pull that off? That's a very interesting question. See, if it had happened in, say, Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, we'd know how they pulled it off. Namely, an order came from the Ministry of Truth and everybody had to obey it. Now, that didn't happen here. Here it happened in the way American propaganda always works, by servility and cowardice and class interest. In other words, we have a relatively centralized media, and there are great advantages to subordinating yourself to external power, which in fact represents your interests anyhow. You know, the mass media are basically big corporations, and they share the interests of other major corporations, which means the interests represented by the state. So it's not too surprising that they would tend to support state power. What is interesting is the uniformity. You know, the virtual lack of deviance. I mean, the fact that in a country as complex as this, one article should appear, namely by Bob Scheer in the LA Times, referring to one of these incidents. And the others, I suppose, were barely reported at all. This is something that you find over and over again in looking at the American propaganda system. So, for example, say, take the invasion of South Vietnam. How did we succeed for 22 years in preventing essentially 100% of scholarship? You know, there's virtually no deviations, preventing it from referring to a historical event that occurred, namely the American invasion of South Vietnam. There is no such event. Take a look, you know. Take a look in the encyclopedias and the history books and the specialized monographs and so on, and you'll see that there is no such event as the invasion of South Vietnam in 1962, or aggression against South Vietnam. It's just not there, you know. How do you get 100% obedience to this? Well, that's a question you really ought to ask yourselves, and it, you know, merits another talk. But the point is, you ought to ask yourselves very much, because most of you, I can judge by your ages, are right in the middle of being trained to be able to do this kind of thing. You know, we have a very intricate system that, and it does it with consummate skill. You know, it does it with consummate skill and with great, you know, great success. So on major issues, you just get no deviation at all. I wish there were time to talk about this topic. It merits a full lecture in itself, but anyway, it's a fact, and it's worth noting. I was told that we have to